things we talked about in closing with respect to, for lack, I don't even know what the word is that I'm looking for, but really akin to what you might refer to as sheep stealing or converting the converted. There was a fairly lengthy fictional account of sorts that started at the bottom of page 169 and continued to the next to last paragraph in 172 that talked about the problem that existed at that time, where men who did not hold the view that it was scriptural to support orphans' homes or the sponsoring church concept would enter into places without revealing their doctrine or their true intention, and rather than going out and seeking the lost, they instead sought to what I would say convert those that are already converted. And this was the case in the 50s and the 60s in the United States. I said it's not so much the case anymore here because the lines of division have been drawn so sharply and clearly, but it is still a problem in many places around the world. I regret that we never were able to get Brother William Woodson here to speak. Brother Woodson at one time was the head of the Bible department at Freed Hardman, and was a good friend of mine, and he and I spent some time. He taught me how to fly fish, and I treasured every moment that I had with Brother Woodson because as he was teaching me how to fly fish, he was also answering my questions about the Bible. He taught Greek at Freed Hardman and was the head of the Bible department for a number of years. Brother Woodson grew up in Jasper. He and his family he was actually converted by Brother Gus Nichols back, I believe, in the 40s. Might have been the early 50s. But in any event, Brother Woodson made, I know, at least 3-week trip, maybe 2, to India because of the problem of non-institutional brethren creating difficulties for brethren in that country. And he ran a circuit, at least one 3-week circuit, and maybe 2, if I just can't remember, dealing purely with the matter of non-institutionalism. And we are still dealing with that among our brethren in Ghana and in Liberia. You know, I mentioned last week that there were some out of a one-cup church in Indiana that were offering to pay our preachers more than we were supporting them if they would teach the one-cup doctrine. And some of them began to do that. I've still got a lot of the correspondence I had with those men at that time. So I went to Liberia in 2009. And so it's been some years, but in Ghana, we're still having this problem in Ghana. And in fact, it's interesting that a number of years ago, the Ghanaian government required all the churches to register with the government and submit their creed. And the brethren, our brethren, invited the non-institutional brethren in Ghana to associate with them and to all register together as being part of the churches of Christ, and they refused. They even refused to be identified with the brethren in Ghana. And then most recently, there's a guy that went with us a number of times from, he used to be at Howe, Texas, where Toby is, and a guy that made the trip with us a number of times who got sideways with the church at Howe and decided to embrace the non-institutional view, and then he has made a number of trips. To Ghana, basically following in our footsteps, trying to convert the churches that we helped establish in Ghana to convert them to the non-institutional view. And that's what I was talking about last week, that our brethren on that side have not built very many churches. They've not established very many churches, but it seems like their work seems to be focused among us, and so I consider those brethren as just like that. I consider them to be brethren, and I try to treat them as brethren. I think I've talked to you about the brother that's been corresponding with me since the Sunday night series started. And he and I have a very good and open relationship about the issues, and we're able to talk freely with one another as they should be. But in a lot of ways, sometimes we are not considered as brethren. In fact, I got a letter a few years ago, I say a few years ago, probably 4 or 5 years ago now, from a preacher who was looking for support to go to the South Pacific to preach the gospel. And in his letter that was sent to us, and by the way, he didn't know anybody here. He didn't know anybody here. And nobody here knew him. And yet he sent us a letter asking for support to go to the South Pacific Islands to preach and evangelize. And here's what he said: because there are no faithful preachers of the gospel in the South Pacific Islands. There are no faithful gospel preachers in the South Pacific Islands. Which I found interesting, because we've been supporting a man for about 45 years in the South Pacific Islands. And there are literally dozens and dozens and dozens of congregations throughout the South Pacific Islands. There's also the Pacific Islands Bible College. And there's the Pacific Islands Bible Correspondence Course. And by the way, Robert Martin does not work alone. He works with Randy English, who has been supported by my home congregation in Dexter, Missouri for at least 30 years. And Randy's a very close friend of mine and my family. Came back and preached my Uncle Hugh's funeral. And so, we know, in other words, I know of a number, 4 or 5 faithful gospel preachers in the South Pacific Islands. And yet we got a letter saying there's no faithful preacher in the South Pacific Islands. And so you see the problem. You see, there's a problem that exists, and I think primarily, first of all, I think the doctrine is wrong. But secondly, there's an attitude that I think is extremely problematic. And so at the end of page 172 over to 173, Stroop goes into an examination of why he thinks some of this came about the way that it did. And in this particular case, over to page 173, there's a lot of phraseology, some things that will get worked out, particularly on our Sunday night series, about the very meaning of the word institutionalism. There are a lot of times words and phrases get thrown out, and they're not very well defined, if they're defined at all. And phrases such as missionary society, benevolent society, words that really, in a lot of cases, have no meaning because they've been overused and misused so often and misapplied so often that they've lost all semblance of their meaning. In other words, the word institution is not a bad word. I mean, the church is an institution. Now, Stroop doesn't think so. We've talked about that. Stroop doesn't like to think of the church as an institution, but I think by definition it is. The home is an institution. Civil government is an institution. And by the way, God established all 3 of those. And so the idea of institutions or institutionalism is by its very nature a difficult course to navigate because we need to define the terms. And on 173, he talks about the matter of institutionalizing the church. And so, but like I said, I'll get to more of that tonight. But in the middle of that paragraph on page 173, it says, to institutionalize means to make a thing an institution. That is, to make it an organization with vested powers of control. Now I think I think that's an accurate statement. But see, now Stroop's going to go in a different direction with this with regard to the eldership. And we've already established several weeks ago that I do not agree with Stroop's view of the eldership. I think he's been inconsistent at times in this book with regard to elders, and I think he's even inconsistent in this lesson and the next with regard to the authority of elders. And we showed that the elders do have authority in the local church. It is a vested authority. In other words, it is an authority that God gave to not just elders, but to the eldership. In other words, Lynn has no inherent authority. Walter has no inherent authority. They serve as elders. But as an eldership, there is certain authority that they have. But Walter cannot make just blanket decisions for the church. Lynn cannot make blanket decisions for the church. But the two of them together can make decisions for the church in matters of expediency. Like, what time are we going to meet? Are we going to have like we do, are we going to have what's called meet and eat? It used to be meet, eat, and meet. Now it's meet and eat, because we have an extended Sunday morning service where I preach twice on Sunday morning, and we have that extended service. Well, that's all a matter of expediency. And the elders have authority in those matters. If at some point Lynn and Walter decided we don't need to do that anymore, they have the authority to make that decision. And so there is some inherent authority, but not in matters of doctrine or matters of practice, only in matters of that are expedient. That is, what is the best way to carry out the work that God has enjoined upon the church. And so, again, this goes back to the time frame. This book was written in 1962, 1963. And I suspect that in that time frame, there came to be an authoritarian view of the eldership. Now, why would people have an authoritarian view of the eldership in the 40s, 50s, and 60s? Well, look at the type of governments that were prevalent during that time. They were authoritarian governments. And even in a lot of ways, the United States government became an authoritarian government. With the internment of Japanese citizens and the confiscation of their property. I mean, even going back to the 30s when FDR decided that people couldn't own gold anymore. They literally took people's gold. I mean, a lot of people don't know this, but they literally took people's gold and did not allow the private possession, ownership of gold. That's an authoritarian policy. All right, and then primarily through the presidency of FDR, which was very authoritarian. Then through World War II, and then the Cold War, and then the rise of the Soviet Union and Communist China, you have just these pictures of authoritarianism, and the idea is that it takes authoritarianism to defeat authoritarianism. All right. Well, then when you start having difficulties arise in the church, where is the church going to look for its authority? It's going to look in that eldership. And I would say that we'd be safe to say that in that time frame, that a lot of elderships assumed for themselves, and I think Stroop, well, he does, he comes right out and says this. Well, I'm going to show you where he says it. In the last paragraph just above the last paragraph at the bottom of page 173, where it says the acceptance of the concept. You see that right there on 173? The acceptance of the concept of the local congregation as an organization in which the elders are vested with dictatorial powers inescapably poses the question of control. So he's talking about an eldership that has assumed for itself authority that the Lord did not that the Lord did not give, or they're exercising their authority in a way that is inconsistent with the picture, I'll just say it this way, with the picture of shepherding. Now, all of you know that I believe there's authority in eldership. And you know that I dealt with Stroop's, what I believe Stroop's false arguments in this book with regard to Hebrews 13:7, Hebrews 13:17, where it speaks of the elders as having the rule over you. And the word rule inherits, that word has in it, in the original language, inherent authority. Now, Stroop made some really bad arguments to try to get away from that, but I don't think he did a very good job. But he does present an eldership as exercising dictatorial authority or power. Now, look, I reject that as well. I reject that as well. But particularly in our day and time, I don't see it as the rule. I don't see it as the rule. In other words, I think he's painted with too broad a brush, and he's misrepresented, I think, a lot of good brethren with the idea that maybe that he's experienced a few bad examples, and now he's applied it across the board. Now, and that's something that we have to be careful about. That just because a thing is done and somebody abuses that thing does not mean that that thing itself is wrong. Right? I mean, people can take things that are right and abuse them, but it doesn't make the thing wrong, it makes the person wrong. And so we don't want to misrepresent, a whole class of people by citing simply a few bad apples or a few bad examples. And so I agree with him on this. I wasn't alive in 1962, okay? And much less alive enough to know what was going on. I see a bunch of y'all grinning because a bunch of y'all were alive in 1962, and so but you understand what I'm saying, that I just don't think it. I agree with him, but I disagree that was the case in point. I have seen elderships, obviously not here. I have seen elderships in other places act in ways more as boards of directors than as shepherds over the flock. I've seen meetings carried out that appeared to be more of like I said, a board of directors or chairman or whatever, rather than men that are trying to lead the flock and be shepherds of the flock. And that's not right. That's not good. But again, I don't think that's the norm, and so I wouldn't want to throw out the whole entire concept of the eldership. All right, now over in he's going to talk about the orphan home question in 174, and I don't want to get into that. I don't want to get into that this morning because we're going to deal with some things on Sunday night. I don't want too much overlap there. Let's look over to page 180 in connection with this idea of organization and structure. This would be a good segue into this final lesson. Second paragraph on 180, and I'm going to read this all the way to 181. See, it's one paragraph that goes from one page to the next. It says, the majority of the churches or denominations have adopted for their respective peoples some form of universal human organization. In other words, every denominational body has adopted for itself rules that apply to everybody in that body. Does that make sense? In other words, if you're going to be a Methodist, then you're going to adhere to the things that are in the Methodist Book of Discipline, because that's the only way you can be a Methodist and have association. Which, by the way, the Methodist Church is fixing to split sometime before summer of this year, and they're going to have a division of property, And they're going to have a division of money. And they're going to have a division of names. And I don't remember what, I think the pro-homosexual side is going to keep the name United Methodist Church, and those that are leaving are going to take, they're going to have to take a different name. Why? To separate themselves from this other group. So now, if you're a Methodist, you have a choice to make. Are you going to accept this side and go by their rules? Or are you going to accept this side and go by their rules? So that's what Stroop is talking about. In other words, every human organization of a religious nature, denominationally speaking, has adopted a set of rules that everybody in that denomination is expected to adhere to. All right? It says, each of these religious peoples have vested the power of control of their entire church or population, either in one man or in a body of men that exercises its authority over the individual members, or through local organizations, or through regional and local organizations. Again, Methodist churches, I don't want to pick on them, but they're an easy target. That they have their convention, and there are regional representatives that go and they vote. And by the way, had it not been for the African representatives, they would have voted in the acceptance of homosexuality and a homosexual clergy. The delegates from the United States and from Europe overwhelmingly voted in favor of the accepting homosexuality as a legitimate lifestyle and homosexual clergy. But it was the African delegates where they won't accept that had enough influence and enough votes to keep it from passing. All right, so that's the idea there. That they vested this authority in a group of people, and then those groups go out to their respective regions or locales, and then they tell everybody what they're going to believe and what they're going to do. It says, in some cases, these powers may be only nominal or routine. All right. For example, the Southern Baptist Convention. The Southern Baptist Convention. And I'm assuming that there's probably some type of Free Will Baptist Convention. Okay? They have meetings, and they have an overarching organization, and they have meetings, and they debate issues, and they make public statements. All right? But not every Baptist church is obligated to agree with what's handed down. For example, a few years ago, the Southern Baptist Convention issued a statement about man's role in the home and in the church, and it was almost a verbatim statement from Ephesians 5. I mean, it was almost verbatim out of the Bible, and of course the news media lost their ever-loving minds over it, that you could teach that a man's supposed to be the head of the household, and men are supposed to lead in the church, and women are to be submissive to their own husbands. CNN and all of them just lost their minds over that. But the whole point was, all they said was in essence what the Bible said. But not every Baptist church had to absolutely adhere to that statement. So that's what I'm saying. Some of them have loose control. In other words, as long as you keep paying your dues, you can stay in the club. You don't have to believe everything that the club puts out, but as long as you keep paying your dues, you can stay in the organization. In others, this is the bottom of 180 over to 181. In others, the unrestricted power of interpreting the scriptures and dictating the practices of its membership. In other words, there are some organizations that have a hierarchy, and at the very top is going to be a group that interprets the scriptures, again, with a dictatorial power. And whatever they decide the scriptures teach is right. And they force you to accept it. All right? This is Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormon Church. The Watchtower Society is the official Bible interpreting and publication printing group among Jehovah's Witnesses. All right? And the Watchtower Society determines what the Bible means for all Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, one thing, by the way, I always encourage people not to slam the door in Jehovah's Witnesses' faces. All right? Because we don't get a lot of opportunities to talk to people to begin with, or at least we don't take advantage of them. If somebody wants to come to my door and talk to me about the Bible, I'm ready. But one of the things that I found in my discussions with Jehovah's Witnesses, first of all, knowing what they've taught through the years, is to, by the way, if you want to give Jehovah's Witness attention, just say, "May I ask you a question?" Whatever they're saying, they'll stop. If you say, "May I ask you a question?" and they'll stop. And so what I do is, I'll just ask a series of questions because, look, the chances are almost zero that you're going to convert a Jehovah's Witness at your front door when they come to it. But what you can do is try to plant a seed in their mind that they can take with them. Greg Cowper, in his book Tactics, refers to it, put a stone in their shoe. You know, nobody walks around long with a rock in their shoe, right? Because every time you take a step, well, if you can put a rock in their shoe, religiously speaking, it can be hard for them. It's not just a matter of taking your shoe off and dumping it out, because once you've put it in somebody's mind, it's there. And so I'll just ask a series of questions about the Watchtower Society. I'll say something like, have you ever heard of the book Millions Now Living Will Never Die? Have you ever heard of the book Millions Now Living Will Never Die? And the reason I asked about that book is I have a copy of it. And the Watchtower Society printed a book titled Millions Now Living Will Never Die. The copyright on that book is 100 years old this year. 100 years old. 1920. They published a book that says millions now living will never die. So we've got to be getting close, right? Because there may be millions of people around the world that are 100 years old. But in about 20 more years, they'll all be gone, right? Well, what's my point? My point is the Watchtower Society wrote a book 100 years ago that I think we all understand can't be right. Or I'll ask them, have you ever heard of Beth Serene? Beth Serene. And they probably haven't heard of it. Well, that's the house that Jehovah's Witnesses built for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to live in. Because they were fixing to come back and live on this earth in the 1920s. By the way, the house is still standing in Southern California. I think it's in San Diego. You can look it up. You can see a picture of the house that the Jehovah's Witnesses built in the 1920s for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But guess what? Somebody else owns it. So what am I doing? I'm planting a seed of doubt in their faith in the Watchtower Society. Are you aware that the Watchtower Society has predicted the end of the world 12 times in the 20th century alone? 12 times. So you see, you plant that seed of doubt because there's this dictatorial group at the top that claims to literally speak for God. And if you can, and by the way, here's another question I've asked, and I've never, ever been able to get a Jehovah's Witness to answer this question. Do you believe the Watchtower Society is infallible? Do you believe the Watchtower Society is infallible? They will not answer that question. They will not answer it. Because they've been conditioned that everything that they believe comes out of the Watchtower Society. So therefore, but they can't tell you that they think that the Watchtower Society is infallible because the Watchtower Society is made up of men. But that's what I'm talking about. That's this type of organization. A dictatorial group that interprets the scriptures and hands those things down. Then you have this one. While still others are allowed the power of decree through which they may set aside certain Bible teachings or may impose human demands, presumably with divine sanction. Now, who does that sound like? If they can set aside some Bible things and make decrees and impose those decrees on others. Roman Catholicism. That's Roman Catholicism. And by the way, not only Roman Catholicism. All of your Orthodox churches are the same way.
What you were talking about, I had, as you said, I invited the men to the house to talk about it.
Yeah.
And I said, well, we got started just a little bit. And I said, well, let me ask you a question before we get started too far. I said, do you really believe we have to be baptized to be saved? And that put them on the road pretty quick.
Really?
Yeah, it did.
That surprised me because Jehovah's Witnesses do practice baptism,
but
not in the Bible sense. But I'd never thought to ask them that question.
That's the first thing. We got in there. We had the Bible open and everything. They was talking and everything. I said, well, no, let me ask you this question.
I'm gonna file that one away.
That's what I put on them.
I'm gonna file that one
I
away.
wanted to see what they was going to lead me to.
Yeah, they led you to the door.
Yeah, they went to the door.
Into the paragraph. All of these, whether it be any of these three types, all of these have departed from the church. And this is the important thing, right? Here's the key. All of these have departed from the church organization of the first century, as it is revealed in the Bible, in that they have interposed a human control between God and man, attributing to the church as they represent it powers and rights that tend to exalt the human and depreciate the divine. In other words, anytime any religious group goes outside of this, then they attribute to their organization a power that supposedly connects man to God, when this is the thing that has been given by God to connect man to God. And so, it's like I'll mention this tonight, but anytime we get away from what the New Testament teaches, then there's a sense in which we cease to be the New Testament church. In other words, there is a plan for salvation that's found in the Scriptures. And a church that doesn't teach that plan can't be the church of the New Testament. There's a plan for the organization of the church that we're talking about here. And anytime a church gets away from that organization that's set forth in the Scriptures, that church cannot be the church of the New Testament. There's a plan for the worship of the New Testament church. And anytime a group gets away from that plan of worship, then it ceases to be the church of the New Testament. And then there's a plan of the work of the church and Christianity. And anytime we get away from that, we cease to be the New Testament church. And so, and then here's the beginning of the next line. It's just stunning to think about it when you if you just accept it at face value. It says, there are other religious people who have virtually overlooked the divine universal organization of the church, and in their opposition to the human plans of the universal church have overdrawn the authorities and powers of the local congregation. And I think that's a good statement that people just simply overlook the divine universal organization of the church. And what he's talking about here is that in opposition to a certain thing, which is, we'll just say this, in opposition to a thing which is an extreme on this side, as the old saying is, they've run past Jerusalem and they've gone over here and they've done something. In other words, they've overcorrected or they've overreacted. All right, and so you'll find this particularly in groups for example, when you start finding groups that are extremely, and I don't want to use the word conservative, but when they bind things that God has not bound, and they're extremely rabid about those things, you'll find that when they leave those things, they don't go back and stop at the truth. They go past the truth to the other extreme. In other words, this extreme begets another extreme. And so that's what I think that's a little bit about what he's talking about here. And so we have to be on guard that whatever it is that we leave behind needs to be balanced, and not that we go from this side all the way over to this side and run past the truth that is in the middle. All right, and that's going to be about as good a place as any for us to close this out, because a lot of this is going to be continued, Lord willing, tonight and then subsequent Sunday nights. All right, for next Sunday, the book Making God in Our Image. Making God in Our Image. Everybody should have a copy of that book. If you don't, there's a stack of them on the left as you're walking out. We will start in that book, Lord willing, this coming Lord's Day morning.